All right, this is FRQ practice for the stabilization policy FRQs that we did in class. So I'm just going to walk through each FRQ practice and just point out things to be aware of and also show you how to answer the FRQ question, how to know if something is important, and to also look for how these FRQ questions are written to help you get to the correct answer. I think most of the time many of you look at the FRQ questions as something that is attacking you, like trying to trip you up, trying to make you confused, but really these FRQ questions are designed to help you get to the right answer. So we're going to start with number 1. So my suggestion, if you are following along with the video, that's fine. But another thing to do would be to answer each FRQ question on your own without looking at the key in Google Classroom, and then watching the video and following along with your answer to see where maybe mistakes were made or where some confusion happened. So that would be my suggestion. So if you want to take time to work on practice 1, go ahead and pause the video and then restart it after you've completed it or after you've made it as far as you can get. So first things first, we always want to read through the entire FRQ before you start answering it. So you want to read through the whole thing, not just bits and pieces, but the entire FRQ before you even start answering. So I'll read this for you. The unemployment rate is 10%, and the inflation rate is 2%. The federal government cuts personal income taxes and increases spending. The Federal Reserve buys bonds on the open market. So we can already go ahead and assume that we're trying to fix a problem. Since the Federal Reserve is buying bonds, we can assume that they're trying to fix a recessionary gap. Same thing with cutting personal income taxes and increasing spending. Those are the tools of fiscal policy. So they're probably trying to fix a recessionary gap. Draw an 80 SRAS LRAS graph that reflects the current economic situation, which is going to be a recessionary gap because the unemployment rate is 10%, which we remember, or you should remember that the goal for unemployment is 4 to 6. Anything higher than 4 to 6% is really high unemployment, and anything below that is too low unemployment. Our inflation rate is 2%, so that means we're lower on our price level. So this is a true recessionary gap that they're going to want us to draw here. Show on your graph in A the impact of the federal government's decision. Based on your answer in B, what's going to happen to the following: real GDP, price level, and unemployment. Draw a loanable funds market that reflects the increase in government spending. What has happened to the interest rate? Draw a money market graph that reflects the Fed's decision to combat the current economic situation. What has happened to the interest rate? Compare the loanable funds market in D and the money market in E to answer the following questions. What's the overall change in the interest rate? And explain. And what's the overall change in investment? And explain. So I've highlighted the key sections of this question here, things that we're going to want to make sure that we keep in mind as we're working through the FRQ, and then more importantly, the word explain. So that means they're going to want us to explain what's happening more than just draw on the graph and shift a line, but actually explain why we've come to this conclusion. So we're going to start at A here. So A is asking us to draw a market economy reflecting this current situation. So our market economy has price level on the vertical, our GDP equals Y equals Q is on our horizontal, and this is going to be a recessionary gap. I pointed out earlier that the unemployment rate is 10% and inflation is 2%. That's going to be our recessionary gap. So we'll label this SRES1, AD1, and then long run aggregate supply 1, and it is showing recessionary gap because our intersection of short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand is to the left. We label the intersection of LRAS with our horizontal YS, and here's Y1 and PL1. Okay, so we've completed A. B, show on your graph in A the impact of the federal government's decision. Well, we know that decreasing taxes will lead to an increase in consumer spending, which will lead to an increase in aggregate demand, and increase in G will lead to an increase in government spending, which will lead to an increase in aggregate demand. So both of these things are trying to increase aggregate demand. We'll label this AD2, and then we're going back to YS, and then we have a new price level, PL2. Okay, so we don't have to write anything for B, so we don't need to have B written down anywhere. You don't even need to have this. This is just a little short note, making sure you're following the right direction, but we don't have to redraw the graph for B. Okay, a lot of y'all in your FRQs, your quizzes, redraw the graphs, and that's where some of the points are coming off of, because you're not actually redrawing the graph that you drew previously, and then you're drawing an entirely new graph, and you're not actually reflecting your answer on the graph that you drew before. So if it doesn't tell you to draw a new graph, then don't draw a new graph. C, based on your answer in B, what has happened to the following? So we're going to start with C1, real GDP. Well, what's happened to real GDP? We look back in A here. We have below potential output, and now we're at potential output, so we've increased. C2 is price level. And what's happened to price level? Well, we started at PL1 and now we're at PL2, so that has also increased. And now C3 is unemployment. And what's happened to unemployment? If this is our high levels of unemployment and now we're back to full employment, then unemployment has decreased. Okay, so there's no explanation, so you can just draw the arrows if you want to, or you can write increased or decreased. We move on to D. Draw a loanable funds market that reflects the increase in government spending. So first we draw our loanable funds market, and that's our real interest rate over the quantity of loanable funds, our supply curve of loanable funds, and then our demand curve of loanable funds. Label your equilibrium points. And then reflect the increase in government spending. Well, if we are increasing our deficit spending, which is exactly what we're doing, if we're cutting taxes and increasing spending, then we're increasing our deficit spending. That means we're going to have an increase in the demand for loanable funds, which means our real interest rate is going to increase. So here's demand loanable funds 2. Quantity has moved, and our real interest rate has increased. So D1, what has happened to the interest rate? Go down here. Can't see it. D1, what has happened to the interest rate? The interest rate increased. Okay. So there's no explanation. We even show that increase in our interest rate on our graph. And then since it's specifying what's actually happening to the interest rate, you want to make sure that you go ahead and write out what's happening. We'll move on to E. Draw a money market graph that reflects the Fed's decision to combat the current economic situation. So our money market graph has our nominal interest rate. and then quantity of money, our supply of money, and then our demand of money. Label this QE, and then RE. So if we are buying bonds, buy equals bigger, which equals increase. So since we're buying bonds, we want to increase the money supply, so our money supply is going to move off to the right. Label that SM2. Here's Q2, and then our interest rate 2. And then E1, what has happened to the interest rate? The interest rate decreased. Okay. F. Compare the loanable funds market in D and the money market in E to answer the following questions. What is the overall change to the interest rate? Explain. What is the overall change to investment? Explain. So we'll start with F1 here. Overall change to the interest rate. Well, we have a problem here. Real interest rate has increased, but nominal interest rate has decreased. So we don't really know what the overall change is. We have interest rates going in the opposite directions here. So F1 is going to be the interest rate change is unknown. So our interest rate change is unknown. So we've answered what's the overall change, unknown. Explain, why is it unknown? So many of you answer the question, but then you don't explain. So you don't get the full point or the additional point in that part of the question because you're not explaining. If it tells you to explain, you have to explain. You can't just answer the question and move on. So the interest rate change is unknown because, and now you're just reading off your graphs here. You're reading off what you've already done and what you've already said. The real interest rate increased, but the nominal interest rate decreased. Okay, so we've answered F1, unknown, and then we explained why we're saying unknown. Real interest rates went up, but nominal interest rates went down. So we don't know what the overall change is. And then F2, what's the overall change to investment? Explain. Well, we know investment is directly tied to interest rates. Higher interest rates lead to lower investment. Lower interest rates lead to higher investment. But our interest rate is unknown. So if we don't know what our change in our interest rate is, can we know what the change in investment is? No. So our investment change is also unknown. So we've answered the question, what is the overall change? Well, investment change is unknown. Now we have to explain. It tells us to explain. It's unknown because we don't know what happened to the interest rate. And if we don't know what happened to the interest rate, then we don't know what's going to happen to the change in investment. Okay, so that's a fully answered. For practice number 1, we have everything labeled. We know exactly what's going on here. It's very clean and easy to read as well. And I point that out because many of you like to write in these little spaces here your answer. And then it ends up looking like little tiny dots. And there's space at the bottom. Even on your quizzes, there's tons of space at the bottom. And you can even write it on the back if you wanted to. So on the AP exam, you can't write your answers and draw your graphs in these tiny little spaces. So make sure when you're answering FRQs in here that you have this whole space filled up. So we're going to move on to number 2. So if you want to go ahead and pause the video so you can work on number 2 and then come back and check your answer and follow along in the explanation. So we always start by reading the entire FRQ question first. The unemployment rate is 6%, and the inflation rate is 9%. The federal government raises personal income taxes and cuts spending, and the Fed is selling bonds. Draw an AD-SRAS graph that reflects the current economic situation. Show on your graph in A the impact of the federal government's decision. Based on your answer in B, what has happened to the following: real GDP, price level, unemployment. Draw a loanable funds market that reflects the decrease in government spending, what's happened to the interest rate. Draw a money market graph that reflects the Fed's decision to combat the current economic situation, what happened to the interest rate. Compare the loanable funds market and the money market in Part E to answer the following questions. Overall change to the interest rate, explain. Overall change to investment, explain. So let's go ahead and get started here. We'll start with A. Draw an AD-SRAS LRAS graph that reflects the current economic situation. Well, unemployment is 6% and inflation is 9%. So we have a teeny tiny inflationary gap because that inflation is pretty high. Unemployment is 6%, so we're technically at full employment, but we do have just a slight inflationary gap. So we're going to go ahead and draw an inflationary gap here. So we have price level on the vertical, and then real GDP equals Y equals Q is on the horizontal, and then we're going to create our teeny tiny inflationary gap. Okay, this is just a really small inflationary gap. Very small. We label that YF, and then we have Y1, and we have PL1. So we got A done. B, show on your graph in A the impact of the federal government's decision. Well, if they're increasing taxes, that's going to lead to a decrease in C, which is going to decrease AD, and then decreasing G will lead to a decrease in G, which will lead to a decrease in AD. So either way we look at this, taxes or spending, we're trying to decrease aggregate demand. So it says show in A what's happening. So we do not draw a new graph for B. We just manipulate our graph that we already drew in A, which is to decrease AD. Okay, so we return back to potential, and we have a new price level, PL2. So we're done with B. We show the impact of the federal government's decision on our graph in A, so we did not draw an entirely new graph for B. We stayed in the graph in A. Let's move on to C. C1, real GDP. Well, what's happened to real GDP? Well, if we started at Y1 and now we're at YF, we've decreased. C2 is price level. Well, if we started at PL1 and now we're at PL2, we've decreased. And then C3 is unemployment. And if we started at Y1 and now we're at YF, I'm going to say unemployment increased. D, draw a loanable funds market that reflects the decrease in government spending. Well, if we have an increase in surplus budgeting here, then we're going to have a decrease in the demand of loanable funds, which will decrease our real interest rate. Or you can increase the supply of loanable funds and have the same result as a decrease in the real interest rate. Both will work here. So label this D. Let's go ahead and draw our loanable funds market. We have our real interest rate, and then we have quantity of loanable funds. We have our supply of loanable funds and our demand of loanable funds. We label our equilibrium positions here. I'm going to go to the demand route, decrease demand of loanable funds. And we have Q2 and R2. And then D1, what has happened to the interest rate? Well, the interest rate decreased. We started at RE, and now we're at R2. So the interest rate decreased. Again, we're just reading what we drew on our graph. E. Draw a money market graph that reflects the Fed's decision to combat the current economic situation. Go ahead and draw our money market here. We have our nominal interest rate and our quantity of money, supply of money, and then our demand of money. We label our equilibrium points. So we refer back to our little introduction part here, sell bonds. Sell means smaller, which means decrease. So we're going to decrease our money supply. Label this SM2, Q2, and then R2. And what happened to our interest rate? Well, our interest rate increased. Again, we're just reading directly off our graph. Some weird responses when I'm having you guys answer questions off graphs that you drew. You would draw the correct graph, and then I would just ask you, well, what happened? And then you'll tell me the opposite, or something not even related to that concept. So if it's asking you what's happening, it's asking you what you just drew. It's just asking, do you understand what you just drew? So now we're going to move on to F1 here. We're comparing the loanable funds market in D and the money market in E to answer the following questions. What is the overall change in the interest rate? Explain. Well, change in the interest rate is unknown. Just like FRQ number 1. Why is it unknown? Well, our nominal interest rate increased, but our real interest rate decreased. So we answered what's the overall change. Change in interest rate is unknown. And now we have to explain. Because the nominal increased and the real decreased. So there's our explanation part. And then we move on to F2. What's the change to investment? Unknown. So we answer the question, unknown, and now we have to explain. Unknown because if we don't know what happened to interest rates, we don't know what happens to investment. So if we don't know the interest rate, we can't know the investment. So you don't only just answer the question, you have to make sure that you're explaining if it's asking you to explain. And that's where quite a few of you start to lose a lot of your points or lose the entire point. Because you answer the question, but then you don't explain, and it tells you to explain. But fully answered, everything is very neat and easy to read. We know which graph goes to which question because we've labeled it with A or D or E. And we're not writing our answers in the teeny tiny spaces up here. Okay, these little notations up here are just quick, easy notes that you could do in the margins so you know exactly what's going on to kind of help guide you in answering your questions. But this is what's graded. Okay, this is what's graded down here. Moving on to 3. So if you want to pause and work on number 3 and then come in and check. So first we want to read the FRQ question all the way through. Suppose the economy is currently suffering from a very high rate of inflation caused by aggregate demand that has increased beyond potential GDP. In a correctly labeled AD, SRAS, LRS graph show the current situation, and a correctly labeled money market graph show equilibrium. In response to this high inflation rate, what open market operation should the Fed undertake? In your graph in A, well actually this is going to be in your graph in B. So in your graph in B, and your graph in A. In your graph in B, show the impact of this monetary policy on the money market and on the interest rate. In your graph in A, show the impact on real GDP and price level. Explain how this open market operation impacted output and price level. Right. So again, these FRQ questions are designed to help you figure out where you're going. They're not out to trick you. They're not out to confuse you. They are there to help you. So we'll start with A here. Correctly labeled AD, SRES, LRS graph that shows the current situation. Well, high rate of inflation caused by aggregate demand beyond potential GDP, that is all leading to an inflationary gap. So we want to set up our inflationary gap here. Make sure you have everything labeled. A lot of you in your activity packets especially don't label anything. You just have random lines drawn about. And then when it comes time to actually draw these graphs for real, you have no idea how to label or where the labels go or why the lines are the way they are. You don't take the time in your activity packet to actually practice drawing these graphs correctly. Move on to B here. In a correctly labeled money market graph, go ahead and show equilibrium. So you can see how important it is to know how to draw these graphs correctly for the FRQ portion of the exam and in class. Even if you're planning on not taking the exam, you have to know how to draw these graphs to be successful, even for the multiple choice questions. In response to this inflation rate, what open market operation should the Fed undertake? So this is C. There's no explanation. There is no be detailed. There is no other indication that we should be more thorough in our answer. So it's just asking us, are we going to buy or sell bonds? That's it. And we want to sell bonds. And then we're done. We don't have to explain. It's not asking us to explain. It's not asking us to justify. It's not asking us for a prediction of what's going to happen in our graphs yet. It's just saying, what open market operation are they going to do? Tell me the end. Sell bonds, done, move on. D, in your graph from part B, show the impact of this monetary policy on the money market and on the equilibrium interest rate. So show, there's no explanation here. We just have to show what's happening. So we're going to show that selling bonds decreases the money supply. And by selling bonds, we have increased our nominal interest rate. We're done. We don't have to explain. We don't have to provide a justification. We are showing what is happening to our interest rate. It went up. D, in your graph from part B, show, E. In your graph from part A, show the impact of this monetary policy on real GDP and the price level. So if we are selling bonds, we are trying to contract the economy, so we're trying to decrease aggregate demand. So our increase in our nominal interest rate is going to lead to that decrease in IG, that decrease in C, which is going to decrease aggregate demand. Go ahead and decrease aggregate demand. Label it 82. We've returned back to potential, and we've decreased our price level. So it says show. We've shown what has changed in our output. Okay, we've decreased it. We have our arrow, and we've shown what has happened to price level. We went from 1 to 2, and we have our arrow. F, explain how the open market operation impacted output and price level. All right, here's your explanation part. So, by selling bonds, the Fed was contracting the economy. Okay, so it's contracting the economy. So it needed to decrease the money supply. Which increased our nominal interest rate, which will decrease IG and C, which will decrease AD, which returns output to potential, or we could say decreased output, because that's what we drew on here, and decreased price level. Okay. Now I know I told you all that there's no sentences. You don't need to write sentences. Well, we didn't. This is not a sentence. This is not a complete sentence. Many of you have become overly enthusiastic about arrows, like this. If you want to write this, that's fine. That's the answer. That explains what's happening. But many of you just start drawing arrows and then don't tell me what's actually going down, or what's actually going up, or what's actually leading to something. Or you write it backwards, which is wrong. All of those are wrong. So if you're going to use the arrows and abbreviations, which you're more than welcome to, you have got to set it up correctly. The interest rate increase, which leads to decreases in IG and C, which leads to a decrease in aggregate demand. If you start down here and you work your way up here, you've gone the wrong way. And that is not true. A decrease in aggregate demand will not lead to those things. So if you want to go the arrow route, that's fine, but you have to make sure you're following the order of what's actually happening. If you're just drawing arrows and letters and hoping it works out, that's not a good strategy for life. Move on to number 4. So if you want to go ahead and pause and complete number 4 and then come back. So we want to read through our entire FRQ question first before we get started. Suppose the economy is currently suffering from a very high rate of unemployment caused by a decrease in consumer confidence in the economy. And a correctly labeled ADS, LRS graph show the current situation. Correctly labeled money market graphs show equilibrium. What monetary policy tool could the Fed undertake to correct the problem? In your graph in A, so this should actually be B, and this is A. In your graph in B, you show the impact of monetary policy in the money market and on the interest rate. In your graph in A, show the impact on real GDP and price level, and then explain how the open market operation impacted output and price level. So we start with A. We want to draw ADS, LRS graph that's showing the current situation. So our current situation here is a very high rate of unemployment, which means we have a recessionary gap. You want to make sure you get everything labeled, because labeling is its own point on the FRQs here. In a correctly labeled money market graph, show equilibrium. So our money market graph has nominal interest rate, quantity of money, supply of money, and demand of money. We want to make sure we get our equilibrium labeled here. What monetary policy tool could the Fed undertake to correct the problem? So it's not specifying what tool, it's just saying what tool. And we have 3 different tools that the Fed has access to influence the economy. They have open market operations, they have the reserve requirement, and they have the discount rate. So it just wants one, but we're going to go through all 3. So in terms of the open market operations, we want to buy bonds. Our reserve requirement we're going to want to decrease, and our discount rate we're going to want to decrease. So to get the full point for C, all you have to do is identify one, but we're going to be extra special and label all 3. D, in your graph from B, show the impact of this monetary policy in the money market. So all these are expansionary monetary policies because we want to expand out of the recession. So we're increasing the supply of money. And we want to show the change in our nominal interest rate. So our nominal interest rate has decreased. In your graph from A, show the impacts of this monetary policy on real GDP. Well, if we have a decrease in our nominal interest rate, that means IG and C are going to increase, which means AD will also increase. So we go up here to A and increase our aggregate demand. We've gone back to potential, and our price level has increased. F, explain how the open market operation impacted output and price level. So this is specifying open market operation. Okay, so let's say in C, you didn't talk about open market operations. You just put decrease the reserve requirement, which would be perfectly acceptable. It will get you the point for C. But F is kind of throwing a curveball at you. It's like, hey, maybe you didn't talk about bonds, but we want you to talk about bonds. So we're telling you to only discuss what's going to happen with open market operations being used here. So for F, our open market operation is buying bonds. And then we have to explain exactly what happened in our money market and our market economy here. So buying bonds is expansionary monetary policy. So with expansionary monetary policy, that means we want to increase our money supply, which means our nominal interest rate is going to decrease, which means IG and C are going to increase, which is going to increase aggregate demand, which has led to a return to potential output, or an increase in output, and an increase in price level. So I kind of reverted back to the arrows here to show you that that's perfectly acceptable. That will get you the full points. But there's an order to it. You cannot say because of an increase in IG that means nominal interest rates went down and that means aggregate demand went up. That's not the order of it. Okay, you have to make sure that you have the order. So it might be easier to actually spell out the whole thing than just using the arrow method, especially if you're losing a lot of points because you're using the arrow method. So we'll move on to 5. If you want to pause, please pause. We're going to read through the whole FRQ. Assume the United States economy is currently in long-run equilibrium. Draw a correctly labeled graph of aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and show each of the following: the long-run aggregate supply curve and current equilibrium output and price levels labeled as YE and PLE. So special labels here. Assume that the government increases spending on national defense without raising taxes. On your graph in A, show how this affects aggregate demand, how this government action affects the unemployment rate in the short run. Explain. Assume that the economy adjusts to new long-run equilibrium after the increase in government spending. All right, so here's your self-correction. So all of you guys that love to self-correct, it's now telling you to self-correct. How will the short-run aggregate supply curve in the new long equilibrium compare with that in the initial long-run equilibrium in A? Explain. On your graph in A, label the new long-run equilibrium as PL2. So we have some special labels. In order to finance the increase in government spending on national defense from B, the government borrows funds from the public. Correctly labeled graph of the loanable funds market show the effect of the government's borrowing on the real interest rate. Given the change in the real interest rate, what's the impact on the following? Investment. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff going on, but we're going to go step by step here. A, draw a correctly labeled graph of a market economy at equilibrium, and we have special labels. So we have PL, and then our GDP equals Y equals Q. Short run aggregate supply 1, and AD, aggregate demand 1. Then our long run aggregate supply right through the middle of that intersection. And we have special labels. Simpsy almost forgot, but we have YE and PLE. So we got A, both parts drawn all in one graph. So we do not have multiple graphs for this. B, assume that the government increases spending on national defense without raising taxes. In your graph in A, show how the government action affects aggregate demand. Well, we know increase in G is an increase in aggregate demand. So we can go ahead and shift AD. We're going to increase it, so we're going to go to the right, label that 82. And I'm going to call this Y1. And I'm going to call this PL1. Why am I using 1s instead of 2s? Well, I remember reading a PL2, and I'm not there yet. So there's one more move that I have to make here, so I'm going to go ahead and use 1s. How will this government action affect the unemployment rate in the short run? We'll talk about B2 here. So the short run change in unemployment is going to be what? What do you think? Well, it will decrease. Okay, if this is full employment, and as we inch our way off to the right, we are decreasing our unemployment. So our unemployment will decrease because employment and or output is increasing. So both of those work. We can say because employment's increasing, as we go off to the right, employment increases. Or we can say output's increasing. As we go off to the right, output increases. So either of those would work. So we've answered it. Unemployment will decrease because, and we've answered our explain part here. Move on to C. Assume that the economy adjusts to a new long-run equilibrium after the increase in government spending. How will the short-run aggregate supply curve in the new long-run equilibrium compare with that in the initial long run in A? Explain. So this is telling you how to self-correct. It's telling you we will self-correct because we have to find a new long-run equilibrium. And then it's telling you what curve you're going to move to create that new long-run equilibrium. And then we have this pesky word explain here. So we're going to start with the actual shift that's going to happen. So we're going to go ahead and shift short run, and it's going to decrease. Label it SRS2. Our output's going to return to potential, and then we're going to label this PL2. So we have our special label of PL2. And let's go ahead and answer C1. So short run aggregate supply will shift left. Because of a variety of things. But we're going to list them all. Because of the eventual increase in nominal wages, so the higher aggregate demand increases, the higher the nominal wages are going to increase, and or commodity prices will increase. Okay. The higher aggregate demand increases, the more expensive our commodities are going to become. So you can put both, or you could put one or the other, and that both of them explain why short-run aggregate supply is shifting to the left. And we did see two. We kind of jumped ahead here. We shifted SRAS, labeled it SRAS2. We're back to potential, and we have our new price level PL2. which is exactly what it tells us to do here. We're going to move on to D. In order to finance the increase in government spending on national defense from Part B, the government borrows funds from the public. Using correctly labeled graph of the loanable funds market show the effect on the real interest rate. So we're going to draw our loanable funds market at equilibrium. So we have real interest rate, quantity of loanable funds, our supply of loanable funds, and our demand of loanable funds, and then our equilibrium points. So if we're increasing our deficit spending, we're going to increase the demand of loanable funds. We're not necessarily deficit spending here, we're just overspending, per usual. And that will lead to an increase in our real interest rate. DOF2, Q2, and then R2. So we've shown the effect of the increase in demand of loanable funds leads to an increase in our real interest rate. And then E1. Given the change in the real interest rate, what is the impact on investment? Well, investment, IG, will decrease. Because the higher the interest rates, the lower investment spending. And that's it. There's no explanation. We can just say IG will decrease. Or you can say down arrow IG. Both are fine. Last one. So if you want to go ahead and pause for this last one, see if you can do it on your own. If you haven't been doing these on your own, I would suggest you try and do number 6 by yourself instead of following along. After you get it done by yourself, then come back in and check. So we're going to read through the whole thing. Assume the United States economy is currently in equilibrium at full employment level of gross domestic product. Draw a correctly labeled ADS, RS, LRIS showing each of the following in the United States: output level and price level. Japan is a major importer of the United States products. Assume that the Japanese economy goes into a recession. Explain the impact of Japanese recession on U.S. equilibrium output and price level. Show the effects in A. Assume the Federal Reserve takes action to curb the effects of the Japanese recession in the United States economy. What open market operation would the Fed undertake? Use a correctly labeled graph of the money market to show how the Federal Reserve policy action will affect the nominal interest rate. Explain how the change in the nominal interest rate in Part C will affect aggregate demand, price level, and real output. Define real interest rate. Indicate the effect of the open market operation you identified in C1 on the real interest rate in the United States. All right, so let's get started. So with A, we are drawing a equilibrium market economy. So we have PL and our GDP equals Y equals Q. We have short run aggregate supply, and we have aggregate demand, and here's long run. Okay, YS and PLE. We don't have any special labels, so we can label how we want. So this one's a little bit, I'm not going to say tricky because these aren't meant to trick you, but it's going to make you think about what the components of aggregate demand are. So let's just kind of recap what the components of aggregate demand are. Aggregate demand equals C plus IG plus G plus X minus M. If Japan is a major importer, that means they're buying products from the United States. That means the United States is exporting these products to Japan. So if Japan is in a recession, do they have money to buy things? No. So can the U.S. export their products to Japan? No. So we are going to have a decrease in our net exports, which means we're going to have a decrease in aggregate demand. So we want to explain this first. So B1, U.S. exports are going to decrease. So we have that decrease in our net exports, which will decrease AD. Which will, and it will decrease price level. Show the effects in A. So you want to go ahead and decrease aggregate demand. AD2, Y2, and then PL2. Okay. C, assume the Federal Reserve takes action to curb the effects of the Japanese recession on the U.S. economy. What open market operation should the Fed take? We're talking about bonds, and we want to buy bonds. Since we're in a recession, we have decreased aggregate demand. We're going to want to buy bonds to help us bounce back. C2 is drawing a correctly labeled money market graph. So we have our nominal interest rate, our quantity of money, our supply of money, and our demand of money. So how is this open market operation we identified in C1 going to impact our money market? Well, we know buy equals bigger equals increase. Okay, so we're going to increase our money supply. And our nominal interest rate has decreased. So our nominal interest rate decreased. And then C3, explain how the change in the nominal interest rate in C2 will affect aggregate demand, price level, and real output in the U.S. Well, a decrease in our nominal interest rate will lead to an increase in IG and an increase in C, which will lead to an increase in AD, which will increase potential output, which will increase output or return to potential, and it will increase price level. So if you want to use the arrow method, this is how you use the arrow method, making sure you're following the order of things that actually happen. So we're done with C. D, define the real interest rate. So real interest equals the nominal minus inflation. Done. And then E, indicate the effect of the open market operation you identified in C1 on the real interest rate in the United States. Well, our nominal interest rate decreased. And our price level increased. So we know price level and nominal interest rate both include inflation. So our nominal interest rate decreased, which led to our price level increase because of that increase in AD. So both of those things mean that our real interest rate decreased. So our nominal interest rate went down, so that means our interest rate that includes inflation is decreasing. But our price level increased. So if our price level is not keeping pace, keeping up with nominal inflation or nominal interest rate, then that means our real interest rate is decreasing. So those are all 6 of the stabilization policy FRQs that we did in class. You have a full key in Google Classroom, and of course you have this video with the key. This is how you approach the FRQs. Okay, they're not designed to trick you. They're not designed to come after you. They're actually designed to help lead you to the correct answer. So it gives you clues, it gives you hints, it helps you figure out what you're doing and what the ultimate goal is. So I hope that this will help you on your mock FRQ next week, or if you're watching this past the mock FRQ. That's an interesting choice, but hopefully this will help you do better on our FRQs in class.